Welcome to the Planeswalker Project.
What's up, everybody? So one of the more popular of this year's Commander Precons is the Vampiric Bloodlust deck, led by none other than the OG Markov himself, Edgar. And just as we did for the Feline Ferocity deck, we're going to be taking a look today at 20 cards that you can add to this deck that together will cost no more than $30 to help improve what this deck wants to do. I have to admit this was one of the more difficult decks to work on, more so than the cat deck, just because the popularity of vampires has caused a lot of the cards I wanted to include to spike. So in a few months when the dust settles off and everyone's hype has kind of calmed down, the prices for some of these might start to come down just a little bit, so just keep that in mind. Now, the main strategy that Edgar Markov seems to be leaning towards is a more straightforward aggro deck with vampires and vampire tokens. The deck actually reminds me a lot of a more aggro take on Gov Guru of Spores, with putting +1/+1 counters on everything and spawning hordes of tokens. It's not nearly as bombastic and combo-centric as Gov, but one of the goals that I personally had in picking cards here was to keep with the vampire flavor, but emphasize more of a low end for the curve to help us get some early fangs on the field. Let's check them out. Starting off, we have a dozen new creatures to add in. Bloodseeker will start off, and it really hinders opponents wanting to cast their creatures, as that little bit of life loss can and will start adding up as they try to cast more and more creatures. I really like this card for A, its low mana cost, and B, its emphasis on life loss for opponents. Cliffhaven Vampire and Drawnus Emissary are also choices that I've personally wanted for a vampire deck for a long while, but we didn't have a white-based commander for vampires. And on their own, the two of these cards don't really have a whole lot of impact, but the Cliffhaven Vampire will steal a life from each opponent whenever you gain life, and the Drawnus Emissary will cause each opponent to lose a life every turn, and then we gain life, which will of course trigger the Cliffhaven. It's not super game breaking, but I like the little bits of life loss here and there that again will eventually start becoming a problem. Another really good low end spell is the Falkenrath Gorger, who is a super powerful 1-drop that can give us 3 power on the board on turn 1, given Edgar's vampire token. If you choose to incorporate more card discard into your strategy, giving each of your vampires in your hand madness can become a huge boon to just discarding them to the graveyard. Shadow Alley Denizen is another great option should you be able to give your creatures haste. And even if you can't, once you start putting more and more creatures on the field, a lot of the older ones will have become more difficult to block. I also like that again, she's a 1-drop, which will make for some effective early game plays. Vampire Cutthroat gives us a hard to block vampire that also gives us lifelink, and it grows with the rest of our vampire army, and so will its impact. This also plays into some of the life gain strategy, which again makes this 1-drop pretty valuable. And our last 1-drop creature is the Viscera Seer, which was a vampire I was actually surprised not to see in this deck. You can always use those tokens spawned by Edgar as fodder to scry. It's also a nice sack outlet should you need other ways to make your creatures die. Next, we have a few vampires that are a bit more mana, but they also bring a lot more power. Markov Blademaster has double strike and gets a counter every time it hits an opponent. Keep in mind though that having double strike means it will be doing combat damage twice. So if it hits an opponent, that opponent is going to give it 2 +1/+1 counters instead of just 1. Now, Olivia Mobilized for War was a creature that originally I was not big on at all. I found she was a lot more aggro-centric than her older counterpart who likes stealing creatures and making them into vampires. But this plays very well into a madness engine that, that aforementioned Gorger offers, and she gives a counter and it gives haste. So we can use this to make the deck more focused on getting out creatures quickly, giving them haste, and swinging it in. I'd say with this build, we actually are using Edgar more as a token engine far more often than for his bump ability. The same can be said for the new Drana, Liberator of Malakir. She's another great addition to the deck, and given her first strike ability, when we deal combat damage, she will give the counter to your other creatures before they hit an opponent because the first strike strikes an opponent first. Now, Yahenni is another great creature to use. I actually forgot that they were in fact a vampire, and this makes them an excellent sack outlet as well. Given that Yahenni gives themselves indestructible and can buff for every dying opponent creature, you should get on snagging up a copy of this card like right now. And the last vampire I recommend adding is a personal favorite of mine, the Necropolis Regent, who can cause our creatures to power up far beyond anything our opponents can control. Unlike a lot of other cards like Drana, who only gives really one counter per combat, the regen will give counters based on how much damage that creature individually deals. The only downside is this card costs 6 mana and 3 has to be black. But then again, in my vampire deck, I really only use red and white as splash colors, and the majority of the deck is in fact black. Now for some non-creature spells. Right off the bat, I want to add more removal to this deck, as removal is crucial to making sure there's nothing in our way to get our damage through. Dreadbore can not only remove a creature, but it also is good for getting rid of those pesky planeswalkers. And then a very flavorful spell for vampires, the Feast of Blood will kill off a creature indiscriminately from whatever color, artifact it is, and it gives us 4 life. Terminate gives us instant speed removal, which, if we can't afford Path to Exile, it's a pretty reasonable budget alternative. And if you can drop it at the end of an opponent's turn and just before you untap, the Urge to Feed can be a powerful way to buff up all of your vampires while possibly killing off something your opponent controls. Now, a card I feel is highly useful in Commander, and given that we're in black and white, and just how absolutely brutal the ability is, Debt to the Deathless is great to drain life from your opponents, all the while boosting yourself up to gigantic amounts of life. Speaking of life gain now, Whip of Erebos will not only give your creatures lifelink, which again, very useful in this deck, but it can also serve as graveyard recursion should your key creature be indisposed of. One of the best enchantments that you can add to this deck is the Cathars Crusade. Given the frequency of creatures hitting the battlefield, this can go crazy very quickly, making a field of 1/1s become gigantic. And last but not least, and perhaps one of the most flavorful cards on this list, is Sorin, Grim Nemesis. It's truly a shame to see Sorin having gotten stuck between a rock and a hard place thanks to Nahiri, but in a deck led by his ancestor, a vampire deck literally could not be complete without some form of Sorin lurking inside. This version I feel is the most useful, given that it gives us card advantage, it can be removal and net us life, and his ultimate can be utterly devastating should we manage to have that highest life total. So anyway, that's going to do it for our budget upgrades of the Vampire Tribal deck. This one was actually pretty close to being $30 on the nose. I hope you enjoyed this video nonetheless, and remember to like and share it with your Commander playgroup. If you're new to the channel, remember to hit that subscribe button to get updates whenever new content is released. If you want to help support the show up our production levels, you can always do so by contributing over at our Patreon at patreon.com/planeswalkerproject. And as always, I will see you all at the beginning of the next upkeep.